Excerpts from Part 2 and Part 3, Chapters 11 and 12 of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. This is not the full original text. Chapter 11. No one is going to live through this. Louis, Phil, and the remaining crew were stationed in Oahu on May 27, 1943, when they were sent out on a rescue mission to find a missing plane. With Superman gone, they were ordered to fly a plane called Green Hornet. Phil didn't trust the plane, but there was no choice. The crew of 11 men flew over the ocean when an engine malfunction caused the plane to fall toward the water. For Louis, there were only jagged, soundless sensations. His body catapulted forward, the plane breaking open, something wrapping itself around him, the cold slap of water, and then its weight over him. Green Hornet, its nose and left wing hitting first at high speed, stabbed into the ocean and blew apart. As the plane disintegrated around him, Louis felt himself being pulled deep underwater. Then, abruptly, the downward motion stopped, and Louis was flung upward. The force of the plane's plunge had spent itself, and the fuselage, momentarily buoyed up by the air trapped inside, leapt to the surface. Louis opened his mouth and gasped. The air hissed from the plane, and the water rushed up over Louis again. The plane slipped under and sank toward the ocean floor, as if yanked downward. Louis tried to orient himself. The tail was no longer behind him, the wings no longer ahead. The men who'd been around him were gone. The impact had rammed him into the waist gun mount and wedged him under it face down, with the raft below him. The gun mount pressed against his neck, and countless strands of something were coiled around his body, binding him to the gun mount and the raft. He felt them and thought, spaghetti. It was a snarl of wires, Green Hornet's nervous system. When the tail had broken off, the wires had snapped and whipped around him. He thrashed against them, but couldn't get free. He felt frantic to breathe, but couldn't. In the remains of the cockpit, Phil was fighting to get out. When the plane hit, he was thrown forward, his head striking something. A wave of water punched through the cockpit, and the plane carried him under. From the darkness, he knew that he was far below the surface, sinking deeper by the second. He apparently saw Cuppernell push his big body out of the plane. Phil found what he thought was the cockpit window frame, its glass missing. He put his foot on something hard and pushed himself through the opening and out of the cockpit. He swam toward the surface, the light coming up around him. He emerged in a puzzle of debris. His head was gushing blood, and his ankle and one finger were broken. He found a floating hunk of wreckage, perhaps 4 feet square, and clung to it. It began to sink. There were 2 life rafts far away. No one was in them. Cuppernell was nowhere to be seen. Far below, Louis was still ensnared in the plane, writhing in the wires. He looked up and saw a body drifting passively. The plane coursed down, and the world fled away above. Louis felt his ears pop, and vaguely recollected that at the swimming pool at Redondo Beach, his ears would pop at 20 feet. Darkness enfolded him, and the water pressure bore in with greater and greater intensity. He struggled uselessly. He thought, hopeless. He felt a sudden, excruciating bolt of pain in his forehead. There was an oncoming stupor, a fading, as he tore at the wires and clenched his throat against the need to breathe. He had the soft realization that this was the last of everything. He passed out. He woke in total darkness. He thought, this is death. Then he felt the water still on him, the heavy, dropping weight of the plane around him. Inexplicably, the wires were gone, as was the raft. He was floating inside the fuselage, which was bearing him toward the ocean floor, some 1,700 feet down. He could see nothing. His Mae West was uninflated, but its buoyancy was pulling him into the ceiling of the plane. The air was gone from his lungs, and he was now gulping reflexively, swallowing salt water. He tasted blood, gasoline, and oil. He was drowning. Louis flung out his arms, trying to find a way out. His right hand struck something, and his USC ring snagged on it. His hand was caught. He reached toward it with his left hand and felt a long, smooth length of metal. The sensation oriented him. He was at the open right waist window. He swam into the window, put his feet on the frame, and pushed off, wrenching his right hand free and cutting his finger. His back struck the top of the window, and the skin under his shirt scraped off. He kicked clear. The plane sank away. Louis fumbled for the cords on his Mae West, hoping that no one had poached the carbon dioxide canisters. Luck was with him. The chambers ballooned. He was suddenly light, the vest pulling him urgently upward in a stream of debris. He burst into dazzling daylight. He gasped in a breath and immediately vomited up the salt water and fuel he had swallowed. He had survived. Part 3, Chapter 12. Downed. The ocean was a jumble of bomber remains, the lifeblood of the plane, oil, hydraulic fluid, and some 1,000 gallons of fuel, slopped about on the surface. Curling among the bits of plane were threads of blood. Louis heard a voice. He turned toward it and saw Phil, a few dozen feet away, clinging to what looked like a fuel tank. With him was the tail gunner, Mac. Neither man had a Mae West on. Blood spouted in rhythmic arcs from Phil's head and washed in sheets down his face. His eyes lolled about in dazed bewilderment. Phil looked at the head bobbing across the debris field and registered that it was Louis. None of the other men had surfaced. Louis saw one of the life rafts bobbing on the water. It was possible that the raft had been thrown loose by the disintegrating plane, but it was much more likely that the engineer, in the last act of his life, had yanked the raft release handle just before the crash. The raft had inflated itself and was drifting away rapidly. Louis knew that he had to get Phil's bleeding stopped, but if he went to him, the raft would be lost and all of them would perish. He swam for the raft. His clothing and shoes weighed him down, and the current and wind carried the raft away faster than he could swim. As it slipped farther and farther from reach, Louis gave up. He looked back at Phil and Mac, sharing the recognition that their chance was lost. Then he saw a long cord trailing off the raft, snaking not 2 feet from his face. He snatched the cord, reeled the raft to him, and climbed aboard. A second raft was sliding away. Louis pulled out his raft's oars, rowed as hard as he could, and just managed to catch the cord and pull the raft to him. He fed the cords through grommets in the rafts and tied them together. He rowed to Phil and Mac. Realizing that the jagged hunk that he was clinging to might perforate the rafts, Phil pushed it away. Louis pulled Phil aboard, and Mac climbed up under his own power. Both men, like Louis, were filmy with fuel and oil. With all 3 of them in one raft, it was cramped. The raft was only about 6 feet long and a little more than 2 feet wide. There were 2 gashes on the left side of Phil's forehead, by the hairline. Blood was spurting from the wounds and, mixed with seawater, sloshing in the bottom of the raft. Remembering what he had learned in Boy Scouts and his Honolulu first aid course, Louis ran his fingers down Phil's throat until he felt a pulse. The carotid artery. He showed Mac the spot and told him to press down. He pulled off his muslin top shirt and t-shirt and pulled Phil's shirts off as well. He asked Mac to do the same. Setting aside the top shirts, Louis dipped Phil's t-shirt in the water, folded it into a compress, and pressed it to the wounds. He took the other t-shirts and tied them tightly around Phil's head, then slid Phil into the second raft. Phil's mind was woozy. He knew that he'd crashed, that someone had pulled him from the water, that he was in a raft, and that Louis was with him. He felt frightened, though not panicked. As the pilot, he was officially in command, but he grasped his situation well enough to know that he was in no condition to make decisions. He could see that Louis had a nasty cut on his finger near his USC ring, but was otherwise unhurt and lucid. He asked Louis to take command, and Louis agreed. "I'm glad it was you, Zamp," Phil said softly. Then he fell quiet. From somewhere nearby there was a small sound, a moan trailing off into a gargle, a mouth trying to form a word, a throat filling with water, then silence. Louis grabbed an oar and circled around as rapidly as he could, searching for the drowning man. Maybe it was Cuppernell, who hadn't been seen since he was deep under water. They would never know. Whoever had made the sound had slipped under. He didn't come up again.